There is a place in the city of Sakai, in Osaka Prefecture, that most visitors to Japan never see. It is not hidden exactly. It is too large to hide, but it is easy to miss because it does not look like what it is. From ground level, it looks like a hill covered in trees. A long forested rise in the middle of a residential area surrounded by water, fringed by a park where local people walk their dogs and feed the ducks in the moat. It could be a nature reserve. It could be a city park that happens to have an unusual shape. From the air, the shape becomes clear, and the shape is extraordinary. It is a keyhole. A perfect, enormous keyhole, with a circular mound at one end connected by a narrowing waist to a trapezoidal platform at the other. The whole structure is 486 meters long. The circular mound at its heart rises nearly 35 meters above the surrounding land. 3 concentric moats filled with water surround it, enclosing a total area of nearly 500,000 square meters. This is the Daisen Kofen, the largest keyhole-shaped burial mound ever constructed. The tomb of a ruler whose name in the traditional account is Nentoku, the 16th emperor of Japan. It is larger in terms of total enclosed area than the Great Pyramid of Giza, larger than the mausoleum of the first Qin emperor in China, larger than any other single burial monument on Earth, and almost no one outside Japan has heard of it. Tonight we begin the story of the people who built it, the story of the Kofun period, the age of great tombs, the age when the foundations of Japanese civilization were laid in earth and stone, and the labor of tens of thousands of human beings working across generations toward a goal that was both profoundly human and almost incomprehensibly ambitious. The age when Japan became Japan. The word Kofen means simply old mound. It is the name that later generations gave to these structures, the burial mounds that are the most visible legacy of the period. The Kofen period lasted from roughly the 3rd century to the 7th century of the Common Era, 400 years during which Japanese society was transformed from a collection of competing chiefdoms into something that we can, with reasonable confidence, call a state. 400 years is a long time, long enough for the political landscape to shift multiple times, for alliances to form and break and reform, for the specific configurations of power to change dramatically while the underlying trajectory of development continued. But the trajectory was consistent. Throughout the Kofun period, political authority in Japan became more centralized, more institutionalized, more formalized. The competing chieftains of the late Yayoi period gave way to the regional lords of the early Kofun period, and those regional lords gradually came under the influence and then the authority of the Yamato kingdom centered in the Kinai Plain. The Kofun mounds are the signatures of this process, written in earth across the landscape. Each mound marks a moment of power, a claim of authority, a statement about the place of the person buried within it in the emerging hierarchy of the Japanese state. To read the Kofun is to read the political history of ancient Japan written in its most durable medium, not in words, which can be burned or lost or forgotten, but in earth and stone, which endure. Why did they build them? This is the first question that everyone asks when they encounter the Kofun. Why would a society invest such enormous resources, such staggering quantities of human labor in building monuments for the dead? The question assumes that burying the dead is separable from the rest of life, that it is a specialized activity with limited connections to the broader concerns of the living. But this assumption is wrong, at least for the people of the Kofun period. For them, the dead were not gone. They were present in the specific places where they were buried, in a form that was different from life, but not less real. The spirits of powerful individuals retained their power after death. They could protect their descendants. They could intercede with the kami on behalf of the living community. They could, if properly honored and properly maintained in their connection to the world of the living, continue to govern from beyond death. The Kofun was not simply a burial place. It was a spiritual infrastructure, a permanent connection between the living community and the power of the sacred dead, a place where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world was thin, where the authority of the ancestor remained accessible, where the ongoing work of governance could continue to be legitimized by reference to the divine power buried within. This understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead was not invented in the Kofun period. It had its roots in the Jomon tradition of burying the dead within the village, keeping them close, maintaining the relationship across the boundary of death. It had been elaborated through the Yayoi period, when the growing complexity of social hierarchies gave the spirits of powerful individuals more specific and more important roles in the ongoing life of their communities. The Kofun period took this existing tradition and amplified it to an extraordinary degree. The mounds grew larger. The investment of resources grew greater. The ritual complexity surrounding the burials became more elaborate. All of this reflected the growing importance of the sacred dead in the political life of the communities that built the mounds. The ruler who could point to the great mound of a powerful ancestor and say, "That power is my power, that legitimacy is my legitimacy," was a ruler whose authority had a foundation that no merely human claim could match. The Kofun were not built for the dead. They were built for the living, for the political purposes of the living, for the ongoing project of building and maintaining authority in a world where the most powerful legitimacy was divine rather than merely human. The shape of the classic Kofun is one of the most distinctive and most recognizable forms in all of ancient architecture. From above, it looks like a keyhole, a round mound at the rear, connected by a narrowing waist to a trapezoidal platform at the front. The round part, called the Enkofun, was the actual burial chamber, the sacred heart of the monument where the dead ruler lay. The trapezoidal part, called the Zenpokokufun, was the ceremonial forecourt, the space where the rituals honoring the dead were performed, where offerings were made and prayers were offered, and the connection between the living and the dead was renewed. The shape was not arbitrary. Every element of it reflected a specific understanding of how the monument was to function. The round mound at the back was understood as the most sacred part, the part closest to the spirit world, the part where the boundary between the living and the dead was thinnest. Round forms have associations with completeness, with the cosmic, with the divine, across many cultures and many periods of human history. The round mound was a concentrated point of spiritual power, the physical embodiment of the authority of the dead ruler. The trapezoidal forecourt at the front was the human end of the monument, the place where ordinary people,
or at least the privileged members of the community who had access to such rituals, could approach the sacred space and engage with its power. It was wider at the front than at the back, opening toward the world of the living while narrowing toward the world of the dead. The transition between the two parts, the narrowing waist of the keyhole, was the boundary, the point where the human world and the sacred world came closest to each other, where the living and the dead were in most direct relationship. The moats that surrounded the mounds were not simply defensive structures. They were spiritual barriers, defining and protecting the sacred space of the tomb. Water has associations with purification, with boundaries, with the separation between different realms in the religious thinking of ancient Japan as in many other traditions. The moat was a line drawn in water between the ordinary world and the sacred world of the tomb. This entire structure, the round mound, the trapezoidal forecourt, the narrowing waist, the surrounding moats, was designed with a precision and an intentionality that reflects sophisticated thinking about the relationship between the human and the divine, the living and the dead, the ordinary and the sacred. The Kofun people were not simply building big graves. They were building cosmological statements in earth and water, physical models of their understanding of how the universe was organized and how human beings could best relate to the powers that governed it. The construction of a large kofun was an undertaking of a scale and complexity that is difficult to fully appreciate without doing the numbers. The Daisen kofun, the largest of them all, contains an estimated 1.4 million cubic meters of earth. This earth had to be moved by human labor, using tools of wood and stone and bronze, without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals for this kind of work, without any of the earth-moving machinery that would make such a project routine today. 1,400,000 cubic meters of earth, moved by people carrying baskets. Estimates of the labor required to build the Daisen kofun vary, depending on the assumptions made about workforce size, working hours, and the rate at which earth could be moved using the technology of the period. But even the most conservative estimates suggest that the project required something on the order of 2,000 workers laboring every day for 16 years. Other estimates put the total labor requirement much higher, 2,000 people every day for 16 years, doing nothing but moving earth. In a society without fossil fuels, without industrial technology, without the dense urban populations that modern construction projects draw on, assembling and maintaining a workforce of this size required extraordinary organizational capacity. It required the ability to feed, house, and manage a large labor force over a sustained period. It required the logistical infrastructure to supply tools and materials continuously. It required authority sufficient to direct this enormous collective effort toward a single goal. The Yamato kingdom that built the Daisen kofun had all of these things. It had agricultural surpluses sufficient to feed a large non-agricultural workforce. It had administrative systems capable of organizing that workforce. And it had the political authority to direct the labor of its subjects toward this specific project rather than toward other possible uses. The construction of the Daisen kofun was not just a monument to the dead ruler buried within it. It was a demonstration of the power of the living rulers who ordered its construction. a statement to every other power in Japan about the organizational capacity of the Yamato kingdom, the depth of its resources, the extent of its authority. You want to know how powerful the Yamato kings were? Look at the mound they built for their ancestor, a mound larger than any other burial monument on earth.
That is your answer.
The timing of Kofun construction was important. The mounds were not built at random intervals whenever a ruler happened to die. Their construction was linked to the agricultural calendar in ways that reflected both practical necessity and ideological significance. The most labor-intensive periods of rice agriculture were spring planting and autumn harvest. Between these peaks, particularly in the late autumn and winter after the harvest was safely stored, there was agricultural slack time. Workers who had been needed in the fields were no longer needed there. Their labor was available for other purposes. The mobilization of agricultural labor for construction projects during the slack season was a widespread practice in ancient agrarian societies. The pyramids of Egypt were built largely by agricultural workers during the flood season, when the Nile's annual inundation made farming impossible. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe were built by labor forces that included significant agricultural components whose participation was organized around the farming calendar.
The Kofun were built the same way. After the harvest was in, the workers came. They came from the surrounding agricultural communities, mobilized by the authority of the Yamato kingdom, fed and housed at the expense of the state, and directed to the construction site where the work of moving earth continued through the winter months. In spring, when planting time came, they returned to their fields. The construction paused or continued with a reduced permanent workforce until the autumn harvest was done and the agricultural labor force was available again. This annual rhythm, construction in winter and farming in summer, shaped the pace of Kofun building and explains why the largest mounds took decades to complete. It was not that the Yamato kingdom lacked the labor. It was that the labor was only fully available for part of the year, and the rest of the year it had other equally essential things to do.
The mound grew slowly, year by year, season by season, winter by winter, and the ruler whose tomb it would eventually become might well be dead and buried within it before the final shape was complete, leaving the completion of the monument to successors who honored their ancestor by finishing what had been begun. The interior of the Kofun was as carefully designed as the exterior. Access to the burial chamber was through a stone-lined corridor called a yokowana, or sometimes a yokokuchishiki sekishitsu, a horizontal entry stone chamber that was built into the body of the mound. This corridor allowed access to the chamber for the burial itself and, potentially, for subsequent rituals and the addition of later burials in the same chamber.
The chamber itself was built of massive stones, fitted together with considerable precision. The stones used were often brought from significant distances, transported to the construction site at considerable effort. The choice of stone was not purely practical. Different stones had different associations, different qualities, different connections to the spiritual world, and the selection of the right stone for the most important burial chamber was a matter of religious as well as practical significance.
Inside the chamber, the dead ruler was placed in a coffin, often made of stone, sometimes of wood, sometimes of a hollowed-out section of a large tree. The coffin was oriented in a specific direction, aligned with the cardinal points or with the specific geography of the site in ways that reflected the cosmological understanding of the period. Around the coffin, the burial goods. The bronze mirrors that we have discussed at length, sometimes dozens of them in a single burial, their polished surfaces turned toward the body of the dead ruler. Iron swords and other weapons wrapped in organic materials that have mostly decayed over the centuries. Magatama, the curved jade ornaments that carried sacred significance from the Jomon period onward. Ceramic vessels containing food and drink for the journey into the afterlife. Personal ornaments and objects of everyday use that the dead ruler would need in the existence that followed this one.
The selection and arrangement of these burial goods was not casual. It was a carefully considered statement about the identity and the authority of the person being buried. Each object had specific associations, specific meanings, specific connections to the sources of power and legitimacy that the dead ruler had embodied in life and was expected to embody in death.
The bronze mirrors spoke of the divine ancestry from Amaterasu, the sun goddess, whose sacred mirror is one of the 3 imperial treasures. The swords spoke of the martial power that was one foundation of political authority. The Magatama spoke of the ancient sacred tradition that connected the present to the deep past of the Japanese islands.
Together, these objects constituted a kind of visual argument for the legitimacy of the dead ruler, addressed not to the living who had accepted that legitimacy already, but to the powers of the spirit world, to the cosmic forces that the ruler claimed to embody and serve. The burial chamber was sealed. The stone door was closed. The corridor was filled with earth and stone, and the mound rose above, marking the place where one of the most important connections between the human world and the spirit world had been established. The sealed chamber, the dark interior, the objects arranged around the still form of the dead ruler. For more than 1,500 years, in some cases undisturbed, the mirrors still reflecting, though there is nothing to reflect. The swords still sharp, though there is no one to use them. The Magatama still curved, still carrying whatever it is they carry, in the darkness where no one has come to look at them for a very long time.
There is something profound about those sealed chambers, something that speaks to the oldest human responses to death and time, the desire to preserve, the belief that something important persists, the refusal to simply let the people we value disappear without trace. The Kofun builders did not want their rulers to be forgotten. They built the largest structures they could, used the finest materials available, invested the greatest resources at their disposal to ensure that the memory of their rulers endured.
And it has endured. 1,500 years later, we are still talking about them. The mounds are still there. The chambers are still sealed. The objects are still in the darkness. The Kofun builders got what they wanted. If you visit any major Japanese history museum, you will eventually find yourself standing in front of one. It might be a warrior, standing at attention in full armor, his face composed beneath the ridge of his helmet. It might be a woman, her hair arranged in an elaborate coil, her expression serene and slightly inward. It might be a horse, its muscles rendered with surprising anatomical confidence, its ears pricked forward as if listening. It might be a house,
its architectural details so specific that archaeologists have used it to reconstruct building techniques that would otherwise be entirely lost. Or it might be one of the simpler ones, a plain cylinder of reddish terracotta, hollow, open at the top, roughly shaped and simply fired, without decoration or elaboration. All of these things are haniwa. The word means, roughly, clay ring or clay cylinder. It is a name that describes the simplest form of the object, the plain cylinder that is the most basic expression of the tradition. But the haniwa tradition encompasses an extraordinary range of forms, from those simple cylinders to the most elaborate figurative sculpture produced in ancient Japan. And they covered the Kofun mounds in their thousands, arranged in rows along the slopes of the mounds, at the edges of the flat ceremonial surfaces, around the perimeter of the burial area. The haniwa stood in silent attendance on the dead ruler within. They were not decorations, not ornaments placed for aesthetic reasons alone. They were functional presences, doing something specific in the ritual economy of the tomb.
What exactly they were doing is one of the most interesting questions in Kofun period archaeology. The origin of the haniwa tradition is traced in the Japanese historical chronicles to a specific event. The Nihon Shoki, compiled in 720, tells the story of the death of the brother of an early emperor and the burial of his attendants with him, alive, up to their necks in the earth around the burial mound. Their cries, the chronicle says, were heard day and night for several days before they finally died. The emperor, disturbed by this practice, consulted with his advisors about alternatives. A craftsman named Nomi no Sukuni proposed a solution. Instead of burying living people with the dead, he would make clay figures to represent them. The clay figures would serve the same ritual purpose, maintaining the household of the dead ruler in the spirit world without the horror of living sacrifice. The emperor approved, and so, according to the chronicle, the haniwa were born. This origin story is almost certainly not literally true. The haniwa tradition began before the specific event described in the chronicle, and its development was more gradual and more complex than the story suggests. But the story captures something real about the function of the haniwa and about the transition they represent.
Whether or not living attendants were actually buried with early Kofun period rulers, the belief that the dead ruler needed a household in the afterlife, needed warriors and servants and horses and houses, was real. The haniwa were a response to that belief. They were the clay household of the dead, the permanent retinue that would serve and protect the ruler in whatever existence followed this one.
In this sense, the haniwa are not simply art objects, though they are remarkable art objects. They are functional items, made for a specific purpose within a specific religious understanding of the world. The range of subjects represented in haniwa is extraordinary, and each category deserves its own attention. The warrior haniwa are perhaps the most immediately compelling. They show fighters in complete military equipment, and the detail is extraordinary. The helmet is shown with its characteristic ridged comb, cheek guards, and neck protection. The body armor covers the chest and back, with articulated protection for the shoulders and upper arms. A skirt-like lower defense protects the hips and upper legs. At the belt, the long iron sword that was the primary weapon of the Kofun period warrior. These figures are not stylized or abstract. They are specific. The armor they wear is the armor that was actually used in the Kofun period, and the Haniwa figures are one of our best sources of information about what that armor looked like and how it was worn. Looking at a warrior Haniwa, you are looking at a 3rd or 4th century Japanese soldier, rendered in clay with a precision that reflects careful observation of actual military equipment. The person who made this figure had seen soldiers wearing this armor, had looked carefully at the specific details of construction and fit that the clay faithfully records.
The connection between the warrior Haniwa and the later samurai tradition is real. The armor styles, the sword forms, the overall military aesthetic of the Kofun period warrior did not disappear when the period ended. They were the foundation on which the later military culture of Japan was built. The samurai of the medieval period were, in many ways, the descendants of the warriors whose clay images stand guard over the Kofun mounds.
The horse Haniwa reflect a transformation in Japanese military and social life that occurred during the Middle Kofun period. Horses arrived in Japan from the continent sometime in the 4th or 5th century, and their arrival changed everything. A mounted warrior was faster, more powerful, and more intimidating than a foot soldier. A network of horse-riding messengers could transmit information across a large territory in hours rather than days. Horses transformed both warfare and administration, making larger and more centralized political structures possible in ways that were difficult on foot. The horse Haniwa record this transformation. They show animals that are clearly understood and valued, rendered with a sensitivity to equine anatomy and posture that reflects genuine familiarity with horses. The flared nostrils, the pricked ears, the specific set of the legs, all of these details are observed rather than imagined. The saddles and bridles shown on the horse Haniwa are consistent with actual horse equipment found in Kofun period burials, equipment that was imported from the continental tradition of horse culture that had been developing for centuries in the steppes of Central and Northeast Asia. The horse came to Japan as part of a cultural package, along with the riding techniques, the equipment, and the social structures that horse culture required. The female Haniwa are the ones that, to modernize, carry the most complex emotional weight. They stand with a composure that is difficult to characterize, not passive, not submissive, not decorative in any simple sense. Their faces have an expression of contained attention, as if they are aware of something that the viewer cannot see, listening to something that lies beyond ordinary auditory range. Their hair is elaborately arranged. The specific styles shown on the female Haniwa, with their coils and knots and elaborate fastenings, reflect a tradition of female hair culture that took considerable skill to achieve and considerable time to maintain. Hair in ancient Japan was not simply hair. It was a statement, a marker of identity and status, and in the case of women with spiritual functions, of their relationship to the divine. Many of the female Haniwa are interpreted as representing women of spiritual or ritual significance. The Miko, the female ritual specialists who served as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds, were among the most important figures in the Kofun period religious landscape. They danced, they chanted, they entered trance states.
They transmitted the will of the kami to the community that served them. If the female haniwa represent Miko, then they were not simply ornaments placed on the mound for aesthetic reasons. They were functional presences, spiritual specialists in clay, who continued the ritual work of the Miko tradition even after the flesh and blood practitioners had gone elsewhere. They stood in their rows on the slopes of the mound, and they did what Miko did. They maintained the connection between the world of the living and the world of the divine. This interpretation gives the female haniwa a significance that goes beyond their role as art objects. They are records of the religious practices of the period, physical evidence of the female spiritual specialists whose work was central to the Kofun world, preserved in clay when the women themselves are gone. Their composed inward expression makes more sense in this context. They are not looking at the world around them. They are looking at something else, something invisible, the spirit world that was their professional domain. The house haniwa are, from a purely practical standpoint, among the most valuable of all the haniwa types. They are models of the buildings of the Kofun period, rendered in clay with architectural detail that preserves information about construction techniques that would otherwise be entirely lost. The Japanese climate is not kind to wood, and very few actual buildings from the Kofun period have survived. The haniwa models fill the gap, providing visual evidence of what those buildings looked like. The buildings shown in the house haniwa range from simple structures to complex multi-room buildings with elaborate roof systems. The most impressive show raised floors, a construction technique that lifted the floor off the ground to protect against moisture and vermin. They show specific roof shapes, hip and gable combinations that are still characteristic of traditional Japanese architecture. They show the specific methods of connecting beams and columns that define the Japanese carpentry tradition. Looking at a house haniwa from the Kofun period, and then looking at the oldest surviving wooden buildings in Japan, the 7th century structures at Horyuji, you can trace the continuity, the specific solutions, the specific proportions, the specific aesthetic of Japanese wooden architecture were already present in the Kofun period. The tradition that produced Horyuji was already centuries old when those buildings were constructed. The house haniwa are not just records of what buildings looked like. They are evidence of a sophisticated architectural tradition that had been developing for generations, that had accumulated solutions to specific problems of construction in the Japanese climate and landscape, and that would continue to develop for another 1,000 years before producing the masterpieces of traditional Japanese architecture that we admire today. There is a category of haniwa that is less commonly discussed, but that is, in some ways, the most intimate. These are the haniwa that seem to show people in the middle of activities, not standing at attention, not posed for formal presentation, but caught in the midst of something. A figure that appears to be dancing, its body in a posture of movement, arms raised, the suggestion of rhythm in the position of the limbs. A figure holding a musical instrument, frozen in the act of playing. A figure in what looks like a ceremonial posture, hands raised in a gesture that is specific enough to suggest a specific ritual act rather than a generic pose. These figures give us something that the more formal haniwa do not.
They give us a glimpse of the living world of the Kofun period, of people doing what people do, moving and making music and performing the rituals that gave their lives meaning. The dancing figure is particularly moving. Dance in the Kofun period was not entertainment in the modern sense. It was ritual, a form of communication with the divine, a way of expressing in the body what words could not adequately convey. The dancer who is frozen in clay was not dancing for an audience of human beings. She was dancing for the kami, for the ancestors, for the powers that governed the world. Her dance, if we could see it, would tell us something about how the people of the Kofun period understood their relationship to the divine, how they expressed devotion and supplication and gratitude in physical form. What they believed the body could communicate that the mind alone could not. We cannot see her dance. She is clay, frozen in a single moment. The moment when the craftsperson who made her chose to capture her, but the posture, the raised arms, the specific inclination of the body, these give us something. A fragment of movement preserved in fired clay for 1,500 years. It is enough to suggest the whole. The making of haniwa was itself a significant enterprise in the Kofun period economy. The workshops that produced haniwa were specialized operations, requiring kilns capable of firing large quantities of clay objects, craftspeople with specific skills in both the making and the firing of the figures, and organizational capacity to produce the thousands of haniwa that a single large mound might require. The haniwa for the Daisen Kofun alone would have required a production operation of considerable scale. Estimates suggest that the mound was surrounded by more than 20,000 individual haniwa objects. 20,000 clay figures and cylinders, each one made individually by hand, each one fired, each one transported to the site and placed in its specific location. The scale of this production operation gives us another way of appreciating the organizational capacity of the Yamato kingdom. The Kofun were not just labor-intensive construction projects. They were also major manufacturing projects, requiring the coordination of specialized craftspeople, the management of materials and fuel for the kilns, and the logistical capacity to move thousands of fragile clay objects from the workshops to the mound. The workshops that produced haniwa were often located near the sites where clay of the right quality was available, which was not always close to the mound itself. Clay suitable for haniwa production had to be clean and relatively free of stones and organic material, and it had to be workable in the specific way that the production techniques required. The craftspeople who worked in these workshops were specialists. They passed their skills from generation to generation, developing the specific knowledge of clay preparation, forming techniques, and firing conditions that produced haniwa of the quality required for the most important burials. Among the most skilled were those who made the figurative haniwa, the warriors and horses and women and houses, making a convincing three-dimensional figure in clay, one that captures specific aspects of anatomy and posture and equipment with the accuracy that the best haniwa achieve, requires a level of observational skill and technical mastery that is not common. These were artists by any reasonable definition of the word.
people who looked carefully at the world around them and found ways to render what they saw in a durable medium. People who had both the vision to see what mattered and the skill to preserve it. Their names are lost. We do not know who made the most remarkable haniwa that survive. We do not know their lives or their training or the specific circumstances in which they produced the objects that have outlasted them by 15 centuries. But the objects remain, and in the objects, something of the people who made them remains as well. The specific observation, the particular attention, the individual choice of how to render this face or that posture or this architectural detail. The Haniwa craftspeople are gone, but they are not entirely absent. They are present in what they made, in the warrior standing at attention on the slope of the mound, in the woman whose expression suggests she is listening to something we cannot hear, in the horse whose nostrils are flared as if scenting something on the wind. They are present in the objects, and the objects endure. Somewhere in the Yamato Basin, in the flat agricultural land that lies at the northern edge of what is now Nara Prefecture, the political entity that we call the Yamato Kingdom took shape. We cannot point to a specific moment when this happened. There was no founding event, no declaration of a new state, no moment at which someone announced that the Yamato Kingdom now existed and that all the competing powers of the Japanese islands should recognize it. Political formations of this kind do not have clean beginnings. They emerge gradually from the accumulation of advantage and the slow tipping of balances that eventually produce a situation qualitatively different from what existed before. But at some point in the 4th century, or perhaps the late 3rd, the balance tipped. One political center in the Kinai region, in the Yamato Basin, had accumulated enough advantage, enough agricultural surplus, enough military capacity, enough spiritual authority, enough alliance relationships to claim a kind of primacy that the other regional powers of Western Japan could not match. That center was Yamato. And from that center, the state that would eventually become Japan began to take shape. The Yamato Basin had advantages that help explain why it became the center rather than some other region. The geography was favorable. The basin is ringed by mountains on 3 sides, providing natural protection against attack from the north, east, and west. The southern opening leads toward the coast and the inland sea, the highway of ancient Japanese commerce and communication. Rivers provide water for the most productive rice farming land in western Japan. The combination of protection and productivity was difficult to find elsewhere. The agricultural base was extraordinary. The flat land of the Yamato Basin, watered by the Yamato River and its tributaries, produced rice surpluses that supported a larger and more complex political structure than most other regions could sustain. Surplus is the foundation of everything else in an agrarian political economy. Without surplus, there is no army, no administration, no prestige economy, no investment in the infrastructure of power. The Yamato Basin had surplus in abundance, and that surplus was the foundation on which everything else was built. The spiritual geography of the region also mattered. The great mountains that rim the Yamato Basin, particularly Mount Miwa to the east and the Yoshino Range to the south, were understood as sacred presences of exceptional power. The kami of these mountains were among the most important in the ancient Japanese spiritual world, and the rulers of the Yamato Basin could claim a special relationship with these powerful local presences. Mount Miwa, in particular, was understood as the body of a great kami, the sacred mountain itself being the physical manifestation of divine power rather than simply a place where a deity happened to reside. The Omiwa shrine at its base, which has no main hall in the traditional sense because the mountain itself is the object of worship, is one of the oldest shrine establishments in Japan and reflects a religious understanding that goes back to the Kofun period or earlier. A ruler in the Yamato Basin was a ruler in the presence of exceptional spiritual power. That proximity to the sacred was itself a source of legitimacy. The political structure of the Yamato kingdom was not a centralized bureaucratic state in any modern sense. It was a confederation, a network of alliances and subordination relationships that connected the Yamato royal family at the center to a series of regional powers arranged around it. These regional powers were the great clans, the Uji, who controlled specific territories and specific functions within the larger structure. Some clans were military specialists, providing the armed force that the kingdom needed for warfare and internal security. Some were administrative specialists, managing the practical work of governance. Some were religious specialists, maintaining the ritual practices that legitimized the political order. Some were craftspeople, producing the specialized goods that the court required. The relationship between the Yamato royal family and the great clans was not simply one of subordination. It was a relationship of mutual dependence, complex and often tense, in which each party needed what the other provided. The royal family needed the military capacity, the administrative skill, the ritual knowledge, and the specialized production of the clans. Without these contributions, the kingdom could not function. The king who tried to rule without the cooperation of the great clans was a king who could not govern effectively. The clans needed the legitimacy and the coordinating authority of the royal family. The king's claim to divine ancestry, to descent from Amaterasu, was the ultimate source of the legitimacy that held the entire structure together. Without that legitimacy, the clans had no framework within which to cooperate, no authority above themselves to appeal to when their inevitable conflicts with each other needed resolution. This mutual dependence created a political dynamic that was both productive and unstable. When the balance between royal authority and clan power was maintained, the kingdom functioned effectively. When it was disrupted by an overly ambitious king who tried to reduce the clans to pure subordination, or by an overly powerful clan that tried to control the king rather than support him, the result was conflict. The history of the Yamato kingdom across the Kofun period is, in large part, the history of this tension between royal authority and clan power, and the various ways in which different periods and different actors managed or failed to manage the balance. The most powerful of the great clans in the middle and late Kofun period was the Soga. The Soga clan's rise to prominence is one of the most important stories in ancient Japanese history because it shaped the context in which Buddhism arrived and took root in Japan. But to understand the Soga, we need to understand the broader clan system and how it worked. The great clans of the Kofun period were not simply noble families in the European sense, families distinguished by their ancestry and their land holdings, but otherwise integrated into a unified social hierarchy. They were more like small states within the state, each one with its own territory, its own productive base, its own military capacity, its own specialized knowledge and function. Each clan was identified by a hereditary title, a cabinet, that indicated its rank and function in the larger political hierarchy. The highest-ranking clans had titles like Omi and Muraji, distinctions that reflected the nature of their relationship to the royal family and to the state. These titles were not simply honorary. They carried specific rights and responsibilities, specific roles in the ceremonies of the court, specific access to the decision-making processes of the kingdom.
Below the great clans were the Bi, the occupational groups who were organized around specific productive functions. The Bi who made pottery, the Bi who worked iron, the Bi who managed the royal storehouses, the Bi who maintained the irrigation systems. These groups were attached to specific clans or to the royal family itself, their labor and their production flowing upward through the hierarchy in exchange for the protection and the position that the hierarchy provided. This system of hierarchically organized, functionally differentiated groups was the administrative backbone of the Yamato kingdom. It was not a sophisticated bureaucracy in the Chinese sense, without an examination system, without a career civil service, without the rational organizational principles that Chinese political theory had developed over centuries. But it worked, after a fashion, for the specific conditions of the period. And it produced, over the course of the Kofun period, the administrative capacity to build the largest burial mounds in the world. The influence of the continent on Kofun period Japan was profound and pervasive, and it is impossible to understand the period without understanding the channels through which that influence flowed. The primary channel was the Korean peninsula, the three kingdoms of ancient Korea, Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, and Silla in the southeast, were engaged in continuous competition with each other, and that competition created opportunities and incentives for connections with Japan. Japan was not simply a passive recipient of continental culture during this period. The Yamato kingdom had political and military interests on the peninsula, and it was an active participant in the complex diplomacy and occasional warfare that characterized peninsular politics in the 4th and 5th centuries.
The most important consequence of this engagement for Japan's internal development was immigration. Over the course of the Kofun period, significant numbers of people from the Korean peninsula and from China immigrated to Japan, bringing with them skills and knowledge that transformed Japanese material culture and administrative capacity.
These immigrants, known collectively in the Japanese sources as the Kikajin or Toreijin, the people who came across, were among the most important agents of transformation in the Kofun period. They brought ironworking techniques that allowed the production of higher quality tools and weapons. They brought advanced ceramic technology. They brought silk weaving skills. They brought the knowledge of Chinese writing, which would eventually become the basis of Japanese literacy. They brought Confucian learning, which would provide the ideological framework for the administrative reforms of the following century.
And among the immigrants from Baekje, In the middle of the 6th century came the Buddhist monks who introduced to Japan one of the great transformative forces in the history of Japanese civilization.
But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, what matters is the scale and the significance of this continental influence. The Japan of the late Kofun period was not the same as the Japan of the early Kofun period, and a major reason for the difference was the continuous influx of people, ideas, and technologies from the continent.
The military dimension of the Yamato kingdom's expansion deserves attention, because it is easy to focus on the cultural and spiritual aspects of Kofun period history, and underestimate the degree to which military force was the foundation of political order.
The Yamato kingdom was built, in part, through conquest. The regional powers of Western Japan that eventually came under Yamato authority did not all submit voluntarily. Attracted by the spiritual legitimacy of the Yamato king and the advantages of membership in a larger political community, some were conquered, some were coerced, some made the calculation that submission was preferable to the alternatives and chose accordingly.
The military capacity of the Yamato kingdom was based primarily on iron weapons and, from the middle Kofun period onward, on cavalry. The introduction of horses transformed Japanese warfare in ways that we have touched on already, and the advantage that mounted warriors had over foot soldiers was decisive in the military competitions of the period.
The warrior Haniwa that we discussed earlier are records of this military culture. The armor they wear, the weapons they carry, the horses they ride, all of these are records of the specific military technology that made the Yamato expansion possible. But military force alone was not sufficient to build a stable political order. Force could win battles and compel submission. It could not, by itself, create the kind of willing cooperation that the large-scale collective projects of the Kofun period required. For that, something else was needed, and that something else was the spiritual authority that justified the power, the divine legitimacy that made the hierarchy seem natural and right, rather than merely imposed and resented.
The combination of military capacity and spiritual authority was what made the Yamato kingdom durable. The swords and the mirrors, the warriors and the priests, the earthly power and the divine legitimacy working together, each reinforcing the other, creating a political system that was more than the sum of its parts.
The transition from the early Kofun period to the middle and late periods was marked by several significant developments. The mounds got larger. The early Kofun period mounds, while substantial, were not yet at the scale of the great monuments of the Daisen type. The growth in mound size across the period reflects the growth in the organizational capacity and the political authority of the Yamato kingdom. Each generation of rulers built larger than the last, demonstrating their greater power and their greater resources. The geographic distribution of the largest mounds also shifted. In the early Kofun period, large mounds were built in multiple regions of Western Japan, reflecting a political landscape in which power was more dispersed and more contested. As the period progressed, the largest mounds became increasingly concentrated in the Kinai region, specifically in the Yamato Basin and the area around present-day Osaka and Sakai.
This geographic concentration is itself evidence of political centralization. The resources to build the very largest mounds were available only to the most powerful rulers. and those rulers were increasingly the kings of the Yamato kingdom rather than regional powers elsewhere. The ritual practices associated with the mounds also evolved. The Haniwa tradition developed and became more elaborate. The burial goods became more standardized across different regions, suggesting that the prestige system of the Yamato kingdom was increasingly setting the standards that other regional powers adopted and imitated. And the relationship with the continent intensified. The diplomatic missions to the courts of the Chinese dynasties, the immigration of continental craftspeople and scholars, the adoption of continental technologies and ideas, all of these accelerated across the middle and late Kofun period, producing a Japan that was increasingly connected to the larger world of East Asian civilization.
By the late 5th and early 6th centuries, the Yamato kingdom was a sophisticated political entity by any regional standard. It was not yet the fully institutionalized state that the Taika reform of the 7th century would begin to create with its Chinese-style administrative system and its systematic legal codes. But it was recognizably a state with a center, a hierarchy, a system of resource extraction and redistribution, and a claim to authority that extended across most of the Japanese islands. The age of the great tombs was approaching its end. The enormous investment in burial mounds would soon be redirected as Buddhism introduced new ideas about the afterlife and new priorities for the use of collective resources. But the political structure that the mound building had helped to build would endure. The Yamato kingdom, with its divine royal family and its network of clan relationships, was the foundation on which everything that followed would be constructed. The mounds are still there, silent in the landscape, their sealed chambers still holding the objects placed in them 15 centuries ago. The political structure they helped to build is still there too, transformed almost beyond recognition, but continuous, a thread running from the 3rd century to the present. That thread began here in the Yamato Basin, in the flat rice farming land beneath the sacred mountains, where a political tradition took root that has not died yet. The great Kofun mounds dominate our understanding of the period that bears their name, and rightly so. They are the most visible and most dramatic evidence of the civilization that built them. But they tell us about rulers and elites, about the people whose power and resources were sufficient to leave such permanent marks on the landscape. What about everyone else? The vast majority of the people who lived during the Kofun period were not rulers or great clan leaders. They were farmers, craftspeople, fishermen, laborers, the people who grew the rice that fed the kingdom, who worked the iron that armed the warriors, who built the mounds with their labor across the winter months, the people whose lives are represented, indirectly and partially, in the Haniwa figures and the scattered remains of ordinary settlements, but who left no individual mark on the historical record. Their lives were the foundation on which everything else was built, and their lives are worth understanding. The basic unit of ordinary life in the Kofun period was the village. Kofun period villages were typically clusters of pit houses, similar in basic construction to the pit houses of the Jomon period, but showing developments that reflect the more complex social organization of the agricultural world. The pit was still there, the shallow excavation that provided insulation and stability. The wooden frame and thatched roof were still there, protecting the interior from rain and cold.
but the houses were somewhat larger on average than Jomon pit houses, reflecting the different household compositions of an agricultural society. Extended family groups, multiple generations living together, sharing the labor of the farm and the child care and the domestic work, were common in agricultural societies across the ancient world. The household was not just a residence, it was a productive unit, the basic cell of the agricultural economy. The village was surrounded by the paddy fields that were its economic foundation. The fields were arranged in the flat land near water, carefully managed to maintain the specific conditions that rice cultivation required. The earthen walls of the paddies, the irrigation channels, the raised paths between the fields, all of this infrastructure required continuous maintenance and reflected the accumulated investment of generations. Beyond the paddies, the village was surrounded by the managed landscape that provided the other necessities of life, the woodland that provided timber and fuel, the uncultivated areas that provided the gathered plants and small game that supplemented the agricultural diet, the river or stream that provided fish and fresh water. This landscape was not wild. It was the product of generations of human management, shaped by the specific needs and the specific knowledge of the community that inhabited it. Every tree in the managed woodland had been considered, its growth encouraged or suppressed based on the specific properties of its wood. Every stretch of the river had been observed across the seasons, its patterns of fish abundance and movement known in detail. The village and its landscape were a single system, and the knowledge of how to manage that system was the most valuable thing the community possessed.
The clothing of ordinary Kofun period people was considerably simpler than the elaborate dress of the court, but it was not without its own character and quality. The basic garment was woven from plant fibers, primarily rami and hemp, processed and spun and woven on simple looms that were present in most households. Weaving was a domestic skill practiced by women as part of the regular work of the household. The cloth produced was plain and functional, without the elaborate dyeing and decoration that marked high-status clothing. The basic form was similar to what we see in the Haniwa figures, wrapped and folded rather than cut and sewn, secured with cords or simple fastenings. Layers were added for warmth in the cold months, removed in the summer heat. The practical simplicity of the wrapped garment style was well suited to a life of physical work. Footwear was typically woven straw sandals, made from rice straw or other plant materials, by anyone with basic weaving skills. The making of sandals was a routine domestic task, and the sandals themselves were not long-lasting. They were replaced regularly as they wore out, a minor but ongoing demand on the household's time and resources. Children's clothing was a smaller version of adult clothing. Children learned the tasks of the household and the farm from an early age, not because childhood was not valued, but because the participation of children in the productive work of the household was both practically necessary and educationally important. Learning by doing, alongside adults who demonstrated the skills and corrected the mistakes, was the universal pedagogical method of pre-literate societies. The food of ordinary Kofun period people was centered on rice, but the full picture of the diet was considerably more varied. Rice was the prestige grain,
the food that marked participation in the agricultural civilization. But in many households, particularly in the earlier part of the Kofun period, and in regions where rice cultivation was difficult, millet and barley supplemented or even replaced rice as the primary grain.
The rice and other grains were supplemented by a wide variety of other foods. The rivers and coastal waters provided fish in abundance, and the archaeological record of Kofun period settlements shows evidence of intensive fishing activity. Freshwater fish, particularly carp and crucian carp, were important food sources near rivers and lakes. Coastal communities had access to the extraordinary variety of marine life in Japanese waters, from the small fish of the inshore waters to the larger species caught on fishing expeditions further out to sea.
Shellfish, the mainstay of the Jomon diet, continued to be important in coastal areas. The shell middens that are characteristic of the Jomon period are less prominent in the Kofun period record, not because shellfish were no longer eaten, but because the greater complexity of the Kofun period economy and the wider variety of food sources available reduced the proportional importance of shellfish in the diet. Vegetables and legumes were grown in gardens near the houses. The specific varieties available in the Kofun period were not the same as the vegetables familiar today. Modern vegetable varieties are the products of centuries of cultivation and selection, but the basic categories were present. Root vegetables, leafy greens, and beans of various kinds contributed to a diet that was nutritionally more diverse than the grain-centered description might suggest. Wild plants continued to be gathered from the surrounding landscape as they had been since the Jomon period. The knowledge of which wild plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were useful for other purposes, was accumulated over generations and represented a significant component of the practical knowledge that households and communities maintained. Fermented foods were important for preservation and for the specific flavors they contributed. Miso, the fermented soybean paste that remains central to Japanese cuisine today, was probably present in some form during the Kofun period, though the specific varieties familiar today were developed later. Fermented fish products, similar to modern shiokara, provided concentrated protein and umami flavor. Pickled vegetables extended the availability of summer produce into the winter months.
Salt was essential and was obtained through trade in inland areas. The salt trade was one of the most important commercial networks of the ancient Japanese world, connecting the coastal salt production areas to the inland agricultural communities that needed it.
Sake, fermented rice wine, was produced and consumed throughout the Kofun period. It was both an everyday beverage and a ritual substance, used in offerings to the kami and consumed in the communal celebrations that marked the significant moments of the agricultural year. The production of sake was a household or community activity, not yet the specialized industrial process it would later become. What did people do when they were not working? The question of recreation and entertainment in ancient societies is one that is difficult to answer with precision, because the evidence is indirect. But we can piece together a picture from the Haniwa, from the archaeological record, and from the comparative evidence of other ancient cultures.
Music was central to social life. The Haniwa include figures holding musical instruments, including a stringed instrument that may be an early form of the koto. the zither that remains one of the most important instruments in traditional Japanese music. Percussion instruments of various kinds are represented. The human voice, in song and chant, was the most accessible musical medium, and communal singing was almost certainly part of the festive life of Kofun period communities. Dance was inseparable from music. The ritual dances of the period, performed at agricultural festivals and religious ceremonies, were communal activities that involved not just specialist performers, but the broader community. The kagura, the ritual music and dance performed in honor of the kami, has roots that go back to the Kofun period and earlier, and in the Kofun period it was almost certainly a more participatory activity than the specialized performance tradition it would later become. Storytelling was the primary form of narrative entertainment. The myths and legends that eventually found their way into the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki were alive as oral traditions during the Kofun period, told and retold in the evenings in the communal spaces of the village by storytellers who were both entertainers and preservers of cultural knowledge.
These stories were not experienced as history in the modern sense. They were understood as accounts of how things came to be, explanations of why the world is the way it is, records of the actions of the kami and the ancestors whose decisions shaped the conditions of present life. To hear these stories was both pleasurable and instructive, both entertaining and educationally important. Games and competitive activities were almost certainly part of Kofun period social life, though specific games of the period are not well documented. Archery competitions, which combine the display of a practically important skill with the excitement of competition, were almost certainly held at festivals and communal gatherings. Wrestling, which has deep roots in Japanese culture and which appears in the historical chronicles as a practice dating to the earliest periods of Japanese history, may have been practiced. Children played. The clay toys found at Kofun period sites, small figures and objects that were made for children rather than for ritual purposes, are evidence of a childhood that included play alongside the gradual assumption of adult responsibilities. The specific games that Kofun period children played are not recorded, but the universality of play in human childhood and the specific evidence of toys give us confidence that it was part of their experience. The natural world was a constant presence in the recreational as well as the working life of the period. Fishing, as we have noted, was both a food-producing activity and a form of recreation. The gathering of wild foods combined the practical with the pleasurable, an opportunity to move through the landscape, to observe its beauty and its detail, to participate in the seasonal rhythms of the natural world in ways that the more controlled environment of the rice paddy did not allow. Seasonal change, the capacity to find seasonal change, the capacity to find beauty in transience, was present in the Kofun period. It is visible in the sensitivity of the best haniwa, in the specific detail with which craftspeople rendered the animals and plants and people of their world. It is visible in the choice of sacred sites, the mountains and rivers and ancient trees that were understood as the dwelling places of the kami, the culture that would eventually produce the Manyoshu poetry anthology, with its extraordinary attentiveness to the beauty of the natural world, was already present in its essential character during the Kofun period.
The specific literary forms had not yet been developed. The Chinese writing system that would allow that attentiveness to be expressed in words had not yet been fully adopted. But the attentiveness itself was there, in the eyes and the hands of the Haniwa craftspeople, in the choices made about which sacred mountains to honor and which rivers to protect, in the seasonal festivals that marked the turning of the year.
The Kofun period was not a golden age in any simple sense. It was a time of significant inequality, of military competition, of the kind of political violence that accompanies the formation of states. The people at the bottom of the hierarchy worked hard for the benefit of those at the top, and the distribution of the period's considerable productivity was not equitable by any modern standard. But it was also a time of genuine cultural achievement, of the development of artistic and spiritual traditions that would shape Japanese civilization for centuries. The Haniwa are beautiful. The Kofun are awe-inspiring. The political tradition that the period created, for all its flaws, was the foundation of one of the world's most durable and most distinctive civilizations. The ordinary people who farmed the rice and fired the haniwa and moved the earth of the great mounds lived lives that were hard by modern standards. But they were not impoverished lives. They were lives embedded in community, in tradition, in the specific beauty of the Japanese landscape, in the seasonal rhythms of agricultural life that connected them to the natural world and to the generations of those who had worked the same land before them.
They were, in the deepest sense, at home. In the year 552, or possibly 538, depending on which source you trust, a ship arrived on the shores of western Japan carrying an unusual cargo. There were the usual diplomatic gifts, the fine textiles, and other objects of value that marked formal exchanges between courts. There was the formal letter from the king of Beki, one of the three kingdoms of ancient Korea, addressed to the king of the Yamato court. And there was a golden image of a seated figure, hands raised in a gesture of reassurance and protection, face composed in an expression of serene attention. And there were texts written in Chinese explaining the teaching that the figure represented. The king of Baekje was sending Buddhism to Japan.
He was not doing this out of pure generosity. He was doing it because he needed allies, and he believed that sharing this remarkable cultural and spiritual tradition with the Yamato court would create the kind of bond that might translate into military support when he needed it.
Whether his calculation was correct is a story for another time. What matters for tonight is what happened when the golden image and the texts arrived at the Yamato court, and what it set in motion.
The reaction at the court was not uniform. The Yamato kingdom was not a simple political entity with a single voice. It was a complex of competing interests, rival clans with different sources of power and different stakes in the religious and political order. And the arrival of Buddhism immediately activated those competing interests.
Some clans saw in Buddhism an opportunity. The Soga clan, which had strong connections to the immigrant communities from the Korean peninsula and from China, was particularly well positioned to appreciate what was being offered. Buddhism was not just a religion. It was a cultural system, carrying with it everything that the most sophisticated civilizations of Asia had developed over 1,000 years. Art, architecture, medicine, philosophy, administrative technique, all of this came packaged with the Dharma. To embrace Buddhism was to embrace civilization in its most advanced contemporary form.
The Soga had been building their influence at court partly through their management of the immigrant communities, who brought with them continental skills and knowledge. Buddhism was the greatest continental import of all, and the Soga were positioned to manage it. Other clans saw Buddhism as a threat. The Mononobe and the Nakatomi were custodians of the traditional religious practices of Japan. They maintained the shrines, performed the rituals, preserved the knowledge of how to communicate with the kami whose favor was essential for the welfare of the kingdom. Their power, their function, their identity, all of this was bound up with the existing religious order.
If Buddhism displaced the kami, these clans would lose everything, and there was a genuine religious fear alongside the political calculation. The kami had protected Japan since the beginning. The rice had grown. The kingdom had prospered. The divine ancestors had continued to favor their descendants because the proper rituals had been maintained. What would happen if those rituals were abandoned? What would happen to the harvests, to the kingdom, to the people, if the kami were neglected in favor of foreign gods from distant lands? The debate was fierce, and it became violent. The Soga and the Mononobe went to war, not just in the corridors of the court, but in actual armed conflict. The outcome was determined not by the relative merits of the two religious traditions, but by the relative military and political strength of the clans that championed them.
The Soga won. The Mononobe were destroyed as a political force. Buddhism was established at the center of official Japanese culture, but the kami did not disappear, and the tension between the imported tradition and the native tradition would shape Japanese religious life for centuries.
Into this complex and charged situation, in 574, a child was born who would become one of the most important figures in the history of Japanese civilization. His name, as history knows him, is Shotoku Taishi, Prince Shotoku, though this is a posthumous title rather than a birth name, and the historical figure behind the title is, like Himiko before him, surrounded by legend and idealization that makes it difficult to see the actual person clearly. What we can say with confidence is that Shotoku served as regent for Empress Suiko from 593 until his death in 622, a period of nearly 30 years during which the Yamato court underwent significant institutional development, and that the specific direction of that development toward a more Chinese-style administration and a more formal incorporation of Buddhist principles into the governance of the state was shaped significantly by his priorities and his vision.
The portrait of Shotoku that Japanese historical tradition has constructed is almost impossibly perfect. He was, according to the tradition, a prodigy from birth, able to hear 10 people speaking simultaneously and respond to each appropriately. He was a devoted Buddhist and a skilled student of Buddhist doctrine, composing commentaries on important sutras that are attributed to him in the tradition. He was a reformer, a builder, a teacher, the architect of the Japanese state. Like all portraits built up over centuries of veneration, this one needs to be read with appropriate skepticism. The historical Shotoku was certainly an important figure, but the Shotoku of the tradition is also a construction shaped by the needs of subsequent centuries to have a founding figure worthy of the civilization they had inherited.
What the evidence supports is this. The Regency period was one of significant institutional innovation in Japan. The court began developing a more systematic administrative structure. Diplomatic relations with the Sui and Tang courts of China were pursued aggressively. Buddhist temple construction accelerated, and the ideological framework of governance was elaborated in ways that would shape Japanese political culture for centuries. The 17-article constitution, attributed to Shotoku and dated to 604, is one of the most interesting documents in Japanese history. It is not a constitution in any modern sense. It does not establish institutions, define rights, or create legal procedures. It is a set of moral and political principles, expressed in a mixture of Buddhist, Confucian, and indigenous Japanese ideas, addressed to the officials of the court and intended to guide their conduct. The first article is the most famous and the most quintessentially Japanese. It says, in effect, that harmony is the foundation of everything. The word used is "wie," a word with deep roots in Japanese culture and a rich set of associations.
Wa does not mean simply the absence of conflict. It means the kind of cooperative engagement in which different elements work together toward a shared goal without any of them insisting on domination. It is the harmony of a well-tuned instrument in which every part contributes its specific quality to a whole that is greater than any of its components. It is the harmony of a well-functioning community in which individual interests are not suppressed but are channeled into collective benefit.
Whether this ideal was realized in the actual practice of the Yamato court is a different question. Courts are not generally harmonious places, and the court of Shotoku's time was particularly contentious, shaped by the recent violent conflicts between the Soga and the Mononobe, and by the ongoing competition between powerful clans for influence and resources. But the articulation of the ideal mattered. It became part of the self-understanding of Japanese political culture, a value that subsequent generations invoked when they wanted to criticize the failures of actual practice and call for better. And the specific form of the ideal, the emphasis on collective harmony over individual assertion, on the subordination of private interest to public good, on the importance of consultation and consensus over unilateral decision-making, would prove to be among the most durable and most characteristic values of Japanese culture. The word "way" is still invoked in Japan today, in contexts ranging from political rhetoric to business management to the design of social media platforms. It has been invoked in very different ways across the centuries, sometimes to justify genuine cooperation and sometimes to suppress legitimate dissent. But it has never been forgotten, and its articulation in that first article of the 17-article Constitution is one of the most important moments in the intellectual history of Japan. The construction of Horyuji, the great temple complex near what is now Nara City, that is attributed to Shotoku's initiative, was one of the most significant cultural events of the period. Horyuji was not the first Buddhist temple in Japan. Temple construction had been underway since the Soga victory over the Mononobe, and the Soga themselves had built significant temple complexes. But Horyuji was built on a scale and with a quality of design and construction that set it apart from its predecessors. The builders of Horyuji brought to Japan the full sophistication of continental Buddhist architecture, a tradition that had been developing in China and Korea for centuries, and that had achieved, by the 7th century, a level of refinement that was extraordinary by any standard. The specific techniques of Horyuji's construction, the complex bracket systems that support the projecting eaves, the precise proportions of columns and beams, the specific methods of joinery that distribute structural loads through the wooden frame, all of these reflect a design tradition of exceptional sophistication. The buildings were engineered to last, and they have.
Main Hall and the 5-storied pagoda at Horyuji are, by the consensus of architectural historians, the oldest surviving wooden buildings in the world. They have been standing for more than 1,300 years, through earthquakes and typhoons and fires and wars, maintained by the dedication of generations of monks and craftspeople who have passed down the knowledge of how to care for them.
To walk through Horyuji is to walk through the 7th century. The wood has darkened to a deep, warm color. The proportions of the buildings, which must have seemed startlingly new and foreign when they were first constructed, have had 1,300 years to become part of the Japanese landscape, to seem as natural and inevitable as the hills they stand among.
The Buddhist art inside the buildings is among the most important in the world. Sculptures that were made in the 7th century by craftspeople who had learned their skills from continental masters, who were working in a tradition that stretched back through China and Korea to India and Central Asia. The great transmission of artistic and spiritual knowledge that the Buddhist missionary movement represented, carrying the achievements of one civilization to another across the entire breadth of Asia, reached its eastern terminus here, in this complex of wooden buildings on a flat plain in the Yamato Basin.
The end of the Kofun period was not a sharp break. It was a gradual transformation, shaped by the same forces, Buddhism and continental influence, and the growing sophistication of the Yamato state, that had been reshaping Japanese civilization throughout the later part of the period. The great keyhole-shaped mounds stopped being built, not overnight, not because of any specific prohibition or decision, but because the social and religious context that made them meaningful had changed. Buddhism introduced new ideas about death and the afterlife that competed with the older understanding on which the Kofun tradition was based. The idea of karma, of rebirth, of a cycle of existences that did not require a specific physical monument to maintain the connection between the living and the dead, was not immediately compatible with the Kofun tradition of sacred burial mounds as permanent spiritual infrastructure. The resources that had gone into mound construction were increasingly redirected toward temple construction. A Buddhist temple performed some of the same functions as a Kofun, providing a sacred center for the community, a place where the boundary between the human and divine worlds was thin, a physical infrastructure for the ongoing work of maintaining the cosmic order. But it did so in a very different way, one that was more portable, more flexible, more compatible with the evolving administrative and ideological needs of the Yamato state. The last large keyhole mounds were built in the early 7th century. By the middle of the century, the Taika reform of 645 had formally prohibited the construction of large burial mounds for all but the most senior members of the aristocracy, and even those were to be built on a much reduced scale.
The age of the great tombs was over, but what it had built was not over. The political structure, the cultural traditions, the religious synthesis, the aesthetic sensibilities, all of the things that had been developing across the 4 centuries of the Kofun period, these continued. They were transformed by Buddhism, shaped by Chinese influence, reorganized by administrative reform, but they persisted.
The thread from the Kofun period to the present is long and complex and tangled, but it has not broken. The imperial institution that was taking shape during the Kofun period, with its divine ancestry and its sacred rituals and its combination of political and spiritual authority, is still there. The aesthetic tradition that found one of its earliest expressions in the sensitivity of the Haniwa craftspeople is still there. The religious tradition that integrated the native kami worship with Buddhism and produced a spiritual world of extraordinary richness and complexity is still there. The great mounds are still there too, silent in the landscape, sealed, enduring.
The Kofun period ended 1,500 years ago, but it has not finished speaking.